I'm Jan Allen. I'm acting director at the Agnes Etherington Arts Center. I want to welcome you all to the 2013 Rita Friendly Kaufman lecture. This is a series of public talks brings scholars of national and international stature to Queen's University each year through the generosity and vision of Dr. Nathan Kaufman and his family. Over a decade ago, they created an endowment in the name of Rita Friendly Kaufman, who was a passionate advocate of art education. They created a wonderful opportunity to learn about and reflect on the broader social dimensions of art history and visual art. Over the years, we've had an amazing range of thought-provoking lectures on topics spanning from the Holocaust era, art restitution, through the history of England's first public art gallery, the story of the Thompson collection, and contemporary artists' engagement with the subjects of war, artificial intelligence, and surveillance. Today we're in for a treat with our guest, Anthony Elms, who's come to us from Philadelphia. Several members of Dr. Kaufman's family are with us here today, and I want to thank them in particular for their generosity in making this part of our program possible. Unfortunately, Dr. Kaufman is not with us except in thought. He will be expecting a full report. I also want to thank the Art Center staff, especially Public Programs Officer Pat Sullivan and our Administrative Coordinator Kate Uxel for helping to organize today's events. And I want to offer my personal welcome to Anthony Elms, our Kaufman lecturer. I have asked, however, Sylvie Fortin, our curator of contemporary art, to provide a closer introduction of Anthony Elms. But first I need to introduce Sylvie. This is, as I mentioned when we were planning, her first sort of public moment, although she's been joined the Art Center staff at the beginning of this year. She's a curator, an art historian, a writer, and editor. She was editor-in-chief and executive director and editor of Art Papers for many years. She led that Atlanta-based publication from being a regional publication to a global thought leader. She was curator of the 5th Quebec City Biennale in 2010. So she's been very active while doing her editing, her international networking at a very highest of levels. She's kept her hand in curating. I first got to know her when she was curator of contemporary art at the Ottawa Art Gallery through the late 90s. She was educated at the University of Toronto, the Université Laval, and Duke University, and has received many national and internationally significant grants and awards. And she's quickly become an energetic and transformative member of the Art Center team. So I hope you're all getting to know her. I have no doubt that you are, actually, and you will be seeing the impact of her work in our programs. Before passing the mic to Sylvia, I want to make a short technical note for you. Following the lecture, Anthony Elms has kindly agreed to field questions from the audience. And because our presentation is being videotaped today, we're going to ask questioners to use a microphone. They'll be available for you. And also to begin by identifying yourself clearly for the record. After our Q&A, I hope that you'll join us over at the Art Center for refreshments and conversation. I'll pass the mic now to Sylvie, and again, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jan, and thanks to everyone for choosing to spend this beautiful day with us today. Most of all, thank you, Anthony, for accepting our invitation and spending yesterday on planes, trains, and automobiles to travel from Philly to share your ideas with us. We really appreciate it. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you here to the Agnes Etherington Art Center and to Queen's University. Anthony Elms joined the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia in December 2011. He works at the ICA as Associate Curator. Prior to that, he was in New York for a short while working with Performa 11, the New York City vastly important performance festival that happens every 2 years. And prior to that, he was in Chicago as the curator of Gallery 400 at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Last fall, he was selected as one of the 3 curators for the next Whitney Biennial, the biennials that Americans love to hate, so he has a nice challenge. But the 2014 edition faces a few additional challenges. It's the last biennial to invest the Brower building, so people will be looking at it attentively with that idea in mind. And also, it's a biennial that's curated by people who don't live in New York, which is also an additional challenge. In parallel to all of his institutional endeavors, Anthony has also maintained an independent practice as an artist, a critic, a curator, and an editor-publisher. For example, one exhibition, which was called Sun Ra, Elms, Saturn, and Chicago's Afro-Futurist Underground 1954-1961, was a real labor of love and commitment that went on then to travel to other institutions across the US. All of these independent projects have provided him with platforms to pursue his engagement with printed matter, with ephemera, and publication in the widest expanded field. We wanted to invite Anthony here today because his practice, I think, uniquely exemplifies a number of the crucial recent developments in curatorial practice. I also wanted to bring him here to begin a conversation, hopefully, that will be going beyond this talk, a conversation with Queens and Kingston, because Anthony was one of the rare writers who, in my prior job as editor, I would always be very surprised by his work. So I was very excited when he would propose an idea or send me a text. I was excited because I knew it would be challenging, and I knew that both myself and the team and our expanded readership would learn a lot in the process. So I knew that publishing his text was publishing something that mattered. And so on this note, I'd like to welcome Anthony.
I guess I'm supposed to do this. Is that right? Okay, great. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Sylvie. Thank you to everyone. Having seen what some of the topics were of past talks, I feel a little bit of a fraud, but it's just some shows I've done. It's just some things and some stuff. Also, I'll just, as a preface, say that I usually really carefully edit and write and script out my lectures, and for the first time I'm trying to go between notes and ad-libbing, because I usually try to not give overviews of what I do, but be completely specific. And so there might be some, please hold in and, join me, but there might be some, like a little, I don't know. We'll hit a pothole here and there, like that one that I just sort of hit, because the word didn't come to my head. Anyways, I'm going to start and return again and again to quotes during this talk. The first one is from jazz composer and band leader and sort of Afro-Futurist Sun Ra, and it's from an interview that he gave in the mid-'80s. And Sun Ra was born in 1914, died in 1993, and he'd been born Herman Blount in Birmingham, Alabama, but for most of his life he claimed that he was an extraterrestrial and from other planets, and that he was eternal, and that he wasn't human, and this was something he always sort of came down to in interviews, of demanding that he was actually from elsewhere and was here to teach us humans something. So, in an interview, quote, "Sun Ra is not a person, it's a business name. And on the certificate, it's a business certificate which was gotten in New York City. They didn't notice that I didn't have down there what my business was. They stamped it, notarized it, and they filed it. So therefore, it's a business name, and my business is changing the planet. So I have legality behind me," end quote. And it actually was a business certificate. He turned himself into a business. This is a picture of the exhibition, and it was built out of an archive of his materials that we found in a basement in Chicago. And Sun Ra had moved from Birmingham to Chicago to start a large band, and then had a series of sort of small groups between like 5 people and 15 people that would all live together collectively. And at one point, he left Chicago to go on tour, and when they got to Montreal, people thought that he had been booked into a rock club, and when they played the first night, the promoter said, "Oh, I thought you were a rock band. I didn't know you were going to play God's music," and canceled the rest of the week of their run. But they had been doing this as a way of sort of getting across the country and across the North American continent, and so they didn't have money. They went down to New York and never came back, stayed with a band member's family, and just accidentally never went back to Chicago. So they left all these materials in Chicago. And I guess when I think of being interested in printed matter and ephemera, I can't say like I'm interested in books per se, even though I buy too many, and I'm not necessarily interested in ephemera like ticket stubs, letterhead, and things like that, like per se, like for a sort of tactility, but I'm interested by like the traces that they leave behind, and this will come back again and again and again. And so the show was a large part like these sort of cases of letterhead that they had developed, advertising, tear sheets that they sent to record labels, letters with record heads, and then these sketchbooks for billboards, and on the left-hand page is their cosmic research center that they were going to build with space communications on the 3rd floor, Department of Sound on the 2nd, and then the sort of Wisdom, Reading, and Cultural Art Foundation on the main floor. And of course, none of these things were ever developed. But one thing, which is why I keep coming to materials like this, and one thing that this show was important for, which I think of maybe one of the first times, even though I'd done lots of shows before this, I was a honest-to-gosh curator, is because to think about Sun Ra and to think about this quote where he's, Sun Ra's not a person, it's a business name, and my business is changing the planet. We can see it as a lark, can see it as sort of a joke to sort of make fun of this idea that he's from outer space, but then he left all of these very real, tangible pieces of material to try to prove it, and to try to make it a reality, and to try to actually change how people saw him and how the things around him were running. And so this exhibition was largely made out of things that would be sort of hopefully interesting visually to people, but also thinking in terms of showing them how they sort of ran this sort of other world on a shoestring dime. So we had album covers that they had done, and they would do the album covers themselves, like print them as woodblock prints, and they would have printing press blocks made. So if they did a 3-color cover, they would print them all by hand. They worked out with the letters would detail how they had talked to RCA Records and convinced RCA Records that they only had to print 20 copies of a vinyl LP at once, so they could keep 60 titles in print, and they could only print the number of copies that they wanted and that they needed for any particular concert or any particular tour. And so it's like these sort of like scrappy ways that they sort of really did create their own universe and create their own sort of world that they could move out from. So at the same time that I did that show, and I should say that I worked on that show with a jazz scholar, John Corbett, and with a poet, Terri Kapsalis, because we all felt that the show was large enough that it needed people from different, you could say, disciplines to work on it. We wanted Terri Kapsalis because she's a poet, and she could think about the wordplay that was in a lot of Sun Ra's materials. John Corbett was the actual scholar from jazz who sort of knew the tradition of where Sun Ra was coming from and musically, like how the music business worked. And that was from the art world and could deal with the ephemera and sort of display and think about the printing techniques that were used for the materials. And so we saw that like we all took on a different aspect of the show, but then came together to make it happen. And then similarly, and this is just a little sliver of it, we curated a show, or I curated a show with another art historian, I shouldn't say another, a art historian, Huey Copeland, and it was based around artists who had sort of come out of Chicago, Sun Ra, been influenced by Sun Ra, and sort of taken some of his tactics. And so this is just a brief sliver of the show, showing a sculpture by Wing Chi Mutu, neon sign by Matt Hanner, banner that had been made by Maitu Pare, and then a sort of photo collage by an artist, Fatima Tugar. And we were looking for like how like his sort of influence sort of expanded beyond him and kept going further and further out. And it's through things like Sun Ra and through sort of thinking through questions of Sun Ra or questions that I started getting more and more interested in actually doing contemporary art, because I'd been a book publisher, and I'm going to speak a fair amount about book publishing even without showing any images of the books I've published, just to sort of say like how, so I do think there are ways that the book publishing has heavily influenced the kinds of things I look for. So an introduction to that is a quote from an interview by art historian Rosalind Deutsch, and she's talking about feminism and what feminism means to her and what it can mean. And she said, quote, "It has stressed the necessity of psychic and subjective as well as material transformation. The question of the relation between the psychic and the social may be difficult to assimilate to conventional notions of activism, but that doesn't make it quietist. We shouldn't dismiss it because it's politically inconvenient," end quote. And I'm not sure if the word quietist is an actual dictionary definition term, but I really like this notion of the quietness and the quietist of a practice, and that just because you can't make the links directly doesn't mean that they don't actually sort of live in the materials that are around us, and that there aren't something that the materials around us mean from this sort of quietist, psychic and social and material transformation. This is an exhibition I did maybe coming out of my interest in books. It was an exhibition of a Chicago artist, Andy Moore. This is the entirety of the exhibition. He'd worked 7 years on making this, basically what's an illustrated manuscript of a book that's 900 and some pages. And it was a whole sort of narrative and a story that he sort of came up with, a sort of parallel autobiography for himself. And the reason it's displayed on this table this way is because that map of a constellation actually is a fold-out for the book. And it's a 12-foot by 7-foot piece of paper that folds out of the back of the book. And we decided to do this one show, like one painting by him, this folded-out map of the stars. And it was really sort of a strange, solitary show where it could only really accommodate 1 to 2 people at a time, because books are sort of strange objects, and you try to sit there and read. And it was maybe not like a blockbuster show, but it was interesting that people would come and spend an hour with the book and they might not read it cover to cover. Some people did come back weekly and sort of dip in and out. And it sort of invited the sort of attempt to sort of come in and sort of slowly go through this handmade, hand-bound book that had been made and was this large, unruly sort of object. So in going to like the quietist of what I think of as like books, because books like this, they're only good for one person at a time. They have covers. They flop open if you put them on a table, or they just sit still. I'm also going to pair that in my head to what I think of as the non-quiet activity of distribution and public display. And so I think it's important to think about distribution, and it's important to address it sort of head-on, because books are some of the most easy things to ignore. It's certainly printed ephemera. They're meant to only last a couple days. They come in and out of fashion. They come in and out of printing. They sort of go and they cycle, and we don't necessarily think about having to keep them or having to store them. But books are very rarely one copy in one edition. And so the material of a thought doesn't transform just because one copy out there in the world has been dog-eared or cut up or discarded. The material of the one copy might obscure the breadth of experience that's had by that same thought in a different copy at any one moment. I might be holding a copy, waving it around, and somewhere else, I'm sure there's another one that's being scanned. There's another one whose contents are being pirated for sharing online. Another is being underlined for a class. Another might be discarded as just simply inane and badly written. And another copy might actually be hoarded for value in a library and never touched. So the distribution of that one thing, that one thought in one form, goes into various contexts, and simultaneously is arguably that sort of like different contexts of one thought can be like the most amazing and good thing that something like capitalism has ever made easy. And without you even having to pick up, if you don't pick up the book, it doesn't do much. It keeps tables level, it keeps the dust in place, but there are thousands of copies of that one book that are out there doing their quiet non-work one at a time. And so insisting that the psychic can take on the social scale of the contents. And a thought, like a bit of wordplay, a theory, an idea, an image, a snippet of a song, can actually be physically tripped over and physically encountered on many shelves and many tables in many different places. If you're not careful, it can even cut your finger. It can get stained, it can get mutilated, it can be inconvenient and heavy to move if you have too many thoughts collected. And it's not just that one thought, one idea, one book equals one voice, because there's a sort of dissonant singing and a sort of conversation that happens by all the hundreds of copies that are singing different tunes through a same song. And you can think of them as sort of variations, all the different ways that someone will read a book, ways that someone will take it into a different context, from an academic context to maybe a poetry reading. There are 1,000 different ways that that one thought sort of functions in different areas. And likewise, as that thought gets used, some voices echo more than others, and some need voices to help them more than others do. And that's where a curator comes in. In an interview, the American sculptor Alan McCollum responded in his use of sort of multiple formats and multiple ideas and doing reproductions. Quote, "It doesn't even necessarily make sense, this idea that the beautiful things should only be available in small numbers. Yet in the art world, we seem to accept this limitation without much question." End quote. It's just a brief view, like another sort of quiet show I did. It was literally just a case of small, tiny collages by an artist, Kay Rosen, who never really shows her collages. She's usually known for wall paintings, such as this, that are sort of word plays and, well, not sort of, really word plays. She studied, she has an English degree, PhD. She didn't go to art school, and she slowly came to painting because of her love of language and how language just looks on the page and how the way that it looks says a lot about what it does and what its function is. And so for the show, I decided to sort of step back and not have her too many wall paintings, which is what she's known for, but one wall painting. And then we showed on a tiny monitor a little video that she made at one point, and then a series of 16 collages that rotated twice during the show. So a total of 32 were shown over the time. It was to invite people in to see like these smaller sort of book pages and where she sort of gets her ideas from, of finding them out in the world actually, by just being attentive to how books are normally printed. So the real way that I came to curating was through this organization, WhiteWalls, which I still print artist books with. And it's an organization that was founded in 1977 in Chicago. And since its inception, WhiteWalls has been dedicated to publishing as an exhibition venue, and seeing itself as printing visual projects and experimental writing, poetry, essays, performance documentation, photography, image tech works, adaptations of film, video, or site-based work. All for makers for whom the printed page becomes both a material and a subject in the form. And so it was always important that WhiteWalls saw itself as dealing with any material that might actually be in a proper art museum or a proper art gallery as well, that it was pulling in all these things that artists were making. Of course, fairly early on, poetry was given the boot by the organization for only visual artists. And then over the sort of 30-some, or almost 40 years, at which WhiteWalls has been active, there's remained like a dedication to fulfilling an artist public project to the artist's specifications. So there's a lot of commissioning and a lot of working in one-on-one dialogue with artists, all within sort of reasonable limits, because we want the books to be not expensive formats, but things that could be sold for $30 or less, like traditional paperbacks. Just to give an idea, like if these names mean anything to anybody, some of the artists that have published have included Dan Peterman, who makes mostly public art projects, Adrian Piper, who does whatever she does, Guillermo Gomez Pena, who's mostly known for performance, an artist, Stephanie Brooks, who's similar to maybe Kay Rosen, perhaps, in her wordplay, Robert Barry, first-generation conceptual artist, Zoe Leonard, who's a photographer, John Giorno, who's a poet, Robert Blanchin, who was sort of an art world gadfly, prankster, Goat Island, a performance group. Kay Rosen was actually published by the organization, which is how I met her. And recently we've been doing more books, and those have been by California sculptor Edgar Arsenault, all the collected art writings of a New York sculptor, Dyke Blair, activist writings by Greg Bertowitz, who's an activist, poet, video maker, sort of the collected works of a group named Haha, which only worked in the public sphere, Sylvia Kubowski, a New York artist of the sort of late 80s, early 90s, Learning Group, which is a group that try to do things out in the field, social practice work in Scandinavia, Sarah Z, Temporary Services, who worked with a prisoner to sort of come up with a compendium of all the things that prisoners invent in their cells to make their lives a little better, a Swedish sound artist, Carl Michael von Hoswolf, and then Canadian video maker, Steve Vranke. We've published his writings, and I co-edited a book with him. And so this is sort of a summary of where that organization is right now. And I'm just going to say that WhiteWalls, the journal, ceased completely in 2003. And for me, it's because publishing really changed, and it seemed that books were the way to be quiet but louder. Because, for example, of that list of artists, not lots of them are people that you would think of as selling thousands and thousands of copies of a book. And we were publishing this journal. People weren't really buying it. Like, libraries were buying it, people here and there, but it was a really sort of mainstream, bare stream. And what would usually happen is people would ask us for issues like years later, when some of the artists became famous. And so looking at that, I thought, well, books actually sit on bookshelves longer than journals. Journals have a shelf life of like 6 months, where a book is never out of date as long as you still have copies. If I've printed a book in 2003 and people don't want that book until 2007, we can afford to sort of wait it out. And the book is still new and people order it because they want it, as opposed to the journals that just kept sort of collecting, and collapsing on me. And so we saw that it was really a way to use the book as a way to navigate what few funds that we had and what little outreach we had, and that we could sort of play a waiting game with our activities and make them reach larger than our actual, which was like me and a volunteer group of 6 people trying to make this happen on a day-to-day basis. So often, my friends in the curatorial realm that don't understand why I'm sort of still interested in editing books at night and carrying the boxes myself and trying to arrange for distribution myself and all this work that I do personally for WhiteWalls, why I'm still interested in it and why I still work on that side instead of just doing things through the museum. And I think it's actually because of what I do in museums too, because I'm interested in 2 things that are hard to think about: quantity and distribution. So to get back to this idea of the quietist, when you publish anything in a multiple format, postcard, print, even a photograph, a book, vinyl record, a poster, a CD, a videotape, a DVD, the most prevalent condition is the most overlooked. And the trouble is because there's no way to actually address what happens with that quantity without speaking, as I'm going to do, in dangerously oversimplified terms. Once the published materials have a place in time of production, once the idea is physical, there's hardly any one thing that you could say about the range of situations in which any individual edition finds itself. And rarely with a quantity of something do you have more than a few token copies in the same location. What can be said with authority is that by publishing books in press runs of around 1,000 or more, and releasing books through conventional distribution channels, the sprawl of the quantity allows the artist projects to sort of be at play in the field as opposed to just on display once. And without committing to a single market nor committing to a single interpretive framework, we can allow that thing to sort of have its multiple lives. And, you can go through the writings, and Karl Marx, Adam Smith, not even Sigmund Freud, all these people that try to figure out what objects mean for us, have written so much about quantity. It's sort of something that's just hard to get around and hard to think of what that quantity does. One of the things that quantity can do is confuse people. This is another exhibition I was involved in, the inauguration of the Council General of the Kingdoms of Algal and Varga land. There are two Swedish artists who have claimed themselves kings, joint kings of the country of Algal and Varga land. You can get passports. They have had council generals opened in cities around the world, and their country, as they see it, is they laid claim to the digital territories, the state that you find yourself in when you're between waking and sleeping. They've declared that all the dead are citizens of Algal and Varga land. When pressed on that, they've said, well, none of them have revoked their citizenship. And then they've also claimed like the spaces that are between any borders on states. So they try to look at those weird gray zones that sort of exist between countries, and they claim all these states. Now, what they have been doing, not that they're recognized by the UN or anything, is like they occasionally have these displays, these events, these concerts. They have a national anthem, a flag, logos. They do have actual functioning embassies. But what they do is they use passports, postcards, advertisements for their airline, diplomatic decrees that they send out, postage stamps, envelopes, a national dish. And they use like all the physical markers that we see around us of what a country is, and they've just slowly been making this country physical by all the trappings of a country without the actual land. And they've done this, and they've had it for moments like at the Venice Biennale and places like this, where like they've sort of engaged in exhibitions such as Documenta, where they've staged little like spaces for themselves. Obviously, there might be a bit of absurd humor to some of the projects I've been involved in up to now, you could say. And all I guess I could say is that there might be a value in exhibitions of not getting it right, but getting it wrong in an interesting and an engaging manner, and thinking of like working through these issues of a sort of questions of small and inefficient, and how that can implicate sort of many people out there. So WhiteWalls, again, to think about publishing and think about now myself as like a curator, what I think about. And it's like when organizing events, performances, and exhibitions, a curator or administrator can pretend that thinking about how to distribute the ideas and the materials is an afterthought, because you've got the object on display, you've got the gallery lights on. But you can't ignore distribution when you're sitting on boxes, dozens and dozens of boxes, weighted down with thousands of copies. Particularly after you've accumulated 60-some individual titles, and each has their unsold copies in tow. Because distribution is what makes a publication a space, and how you manipulate printed matter is well known. You pick it up, you move it, you set it down, you read it, you give it away, it's a gift, it clings to you as you move, but no one printed copy is that entire story. So the dispersal allows for the mistreatment of the materials, and most certainly in the case of books, records, and printed ephemera, they get lost. But these published projects end up as platforms, placemats, coasters, doorstops, headrests, and shades as well, perhaps. They often get tossed aside. Somebody marks them up, somebody steals one. And it's the sly, sort of tactical ways that distribution allows for very public gestures in very quiet ways to still have connections to a personal one, the original idea, the story, the poem, the picture. And I think of it as like allowing an institution to behave briefly for a little bit more like an intervention than an institution. And I like to think that that's how I actually ended up sort of curating, with like a fascination of how you distribute these ideas to the public. So it's an equation that I'm also still grappling with, and I keep returning again and again to sort of pan-national publishing concern Dexter Sinister, which are actually a sort of graphic design firm / artist group. And they wrote a couple years ago, quality is merely the distribution aspect of quantity, and quantity is merely the distribution aspect of quality. And I'm still not sure how these two equations sort of fight with each other, or these two positions sort of balance each other. But I knew that the crucial question is in sort of figuring out how that distribution of material appropriately balances between quality and quantity, and how you find the quantity in the small qualities that might exist and allow different quantities to sort of exist, if that sort of makes any sense. and likely it doesn't. So for example, to think through one of the ways that they think about quality and quantity, this is a project I curated with them called the Plastic Arts. It was in 3 galleries, 3 rooms, and it was 18 panels of vinyl wall text, 2 prints, and a painting. There's the painting, there's the other print. And the vinyl wall labels told one story, and the story that it told was about the process by which they made the font that this piece is made from. And the font is called Meta, the Difference Between the Two. And then interspersed with that, and you can sort of barely see it, but the reason why the image sort of wavers is because they have embedded within this description of how they made their font the same quote 3 times by William James, which is about plasticity and how the strength of a form isn't that it breaks or doesn't break, but how much a material can still hold of its own integrity as it's breaking. And that like as the form sort of shifts, it's like where that shift happens that you see whether or not the material breaks. If it's a clean break and changes into something else, say if you cut a painting in 2 and it breaks in half, you've got like a bad painting on your hands suddenly. But there are other forms that are a little bit more looser and that allow for like some play. And it's not that something like a book might be stronger than a painting, but the plasticity of its sort of strength is that the words can be read out loud, they can be printed in different formats, they can be excerpted, and that's like the plasticity of how that form sort of navigates its different things. It shows you like a strength of the material that's used. Why they did it 3 times is because Meta, the difference between the two, is not really a font, but it's a computer program with just a series of equations, and every time they enter the equations into or every time they enter information into this equation that they built, a different form comes out. So Meta, the difference between the two, is a font that they don't know what it will look like when they output it. And it has an infinitely variable set of variables depending on the numbers that are entered into the equation. And so they were doing this at the same time that they were also presenting the same essay as a book, and they were presenting the same essay in Italy as a lecture. And so like they were interested in like the plastic arts and thinking of this form as like a variable. And this, as it was on display in Chicago, was just one version of the many versions. And these paintings and 2 prints were just reminders of hoping to draw people in, even though they weren't spoken about at all in the wall text, to remind people of the plastic arts, as in painting, photography, drawing, printmaking, and that they are of value. As I mentioned, Dexter Sinister is a sort of publishing concern. And to think about why they are important to me, and they're in my current show, I've worked with them on 3 shows now, 4 shows, is because what I like about them is that they transform what can be plainly transformed. They do books, they do journals, they do a website, they do a wall text, they make plaques, a recording, a broadcast, metal signage, neon, exhibition presentations, paper ephemeral, vinyl LPs. All these things are formats, not artworks per se, but formats. And not coincidentally, these formats can have a material touch, and they're also industrial produced and or distributed. And so it's like this sort of like one thought, multiple formats, multiple different types of distribution. They're interested in whatever kind of material can offer an opportunity for an engaged and handling and formalized release. Interest in that point where something in flux becomes something in public. And that opportunity is always manifested in a sort of multiplication, the distribution of multiple copies, a book, a lecture, a wall vinyl, 18 panels of wall vinyl all at the same time. And they think about this economy of what happens when you make public, making multiple, trying to explain the situation appropriately for its different frames and for its different sort of outgrowths. They change tone, they change style, they change context, but not their message. And it's that ability to exist simultaneously in order and disorder again, and at every level of valuation in between, that allows an opportunity for the unexpected engagements, maybe that sort of just brief moment. And for like, in that brief moment, and it sort of exempts issues of aesthetics or politics outright as commonly applied to art objects. It allows the item to be judged simply as a thing, and once you get into its thingness, that's all it can take to change your perception of what you're actually dealing with there in front of you, at least I would hope. And I think that's kind of what the skill can be of format and quality and quantity as it goes out. Quantity equals opportunities. Opportunities equal places to enact quality. I also think that if you think about museums as being keepers of materials, it's a way in which sort of institutional archives, which always miss things, sort of can be made up for, because surely somebody has saved the format, in some presentation. To that, I think of a statement by the artist John Miller relative to the cultural value of artworks, and a comment that he made sort of in the course of discussing artist books. Quote, "We tend to presume, and as an artist I'm inclined to presume, that the relevance of artwork should be long range. If anything, it should become more relevant as time goes by, and therefore qualified to be preserved. But this might not be the case." End quote. And as cynical as that can seem, and sort of like, I do think his assessment is kind of correct. As we all know, there's very few winners in the art world, and there's lots of people that get left behind and don't get in the big shows. But I would like to think that sort of attending to sort of like the quietist of something like books or publications allows to sort of the cast aside to not be irrelevant, even if they are irrelevant to the major archives and the major exhibitions. I like to think that in Miller's assessment, that having enough physical copies out there of something guarantees that the irrelevant and the marginalized and all those others that sort of might not qualify to be preserved at any one moment do find a space, even if that space might be small, compromised, private, uncomfortable, or imperfect. They can be somewhere in a basement, just waiting to be found. It's a video still from Karen Klimnik. I don't know how to ad-lib through this yet, because I'm still making it up as I go along, you could say. This is an exhibition of mine that's up now through July 28th at the ICA. And why I say I'm sort of making it up as I go along is because once exhibitions open, it seems like that's the moment when you actually find out what they mean. And I'm still learning what this exhibition means. I haven't sort of like sat on it and decided what it is. But we'll try to do something with it. This is entering the show. This is sort of what you would see if you do that sort of naturally entering in a space and looking to the left. Then you would look to the right, and you would see this, which is a full-scale costume by the artist Frances Stark. And it's one of 3 sort of sculpture outfits that she's made that are to her scale that she wears for performances, where she discusses her addiction to online chatting in the form of an old-fashioned rotary dial telephone. The wall labels for this show very rarely describe the exhibition or the piece, but they often sort of go outside the pieces to things that I couldn't stop thinking of. And so just as an introduction, I guess, I will read the wall label, because this would be the first wall label you would read. And it says, Frances Stark, in the title of the piece, "The inchoate incarnate, after a drawing, toward an opera, but before a libretto even exists." That's the full title. After a drawing, because there's a drawing of this form, toward an opera, because she intended to make an opera that she's never actually written, before a libretto even exists. That libretto's still somewhere in between. And then underneath it, I have a quote from Roland Barthes. "We have not talked enough about the profoundly narcissistic and erotic value of clothes. That includes all fashions. However, paradoxically, I would say that there is not any figure of fashion which is erotic in itself. A body which is completely covered can be deemed as erotic by society. Eroticism is linked to the contrast in norms of any one society. Taking off clothes is not erotic in itself." I partly started with that quote, and it's a shame I should be wearing that costume right now, because it's made out of tulle fabric and like piled wool, and then it has like this delicate sort of gold stitching that keeps the whole thing together. And it's very quite like a seductive object that just can't help but sort of suck you in. And so I thought, like, to set this off, like, let's think about how these things are that sort of seduce us, that bring us in, and what these materials that we sort of surround ourselves with are. So then you looked around on the walls, an advertisement by Dexter Sinister for a watch, which is right here, which anybody wants to see, I can show later. When I asked them to be in the show, they had made this watch, and I said, great, how do we show it? And they said, well, you're going to wear it for the entire length of the show. I said, oh, okay. Wasn't prepared to be implicated myself. A video by the artist Karen Klimnik, sort of turned the side. A pile of clothing by, well, it used to be Toronto-based, but now he's, well, then he was Paris-based, but Scott Trelevin, originally from Toronto. Photographer Aaron Leland, Polish painter Paulina Oloska. And then finally, there was the wall text there. I'm just going to read the main wall text because it does sort of maybe be it's the easiest summary I've found yet for the show. Fashion is an industry, a seasonal cycle, an economic indicator, a luxury, a trifle, a necessity, and a symbol of class. For this exhibition, these possibilities are eschewed in favor of the fact that fashion is also, according to British novelist J.G. Ballard, quote, a recognition that nature has endowed us with one skin too few, and that a fully sentient being should wear its nervous system externally, end quote. In looking for the nervous system worn externally, examples are brought together from outlandish costumes to self-published magazines, jewelry to sculpture, performance to painting, commercials to photography, video, and a season's fashion collection. The works tactically adorn the body with a distinctive sense of pose, the exclusive provenance of neither the advertisement nor the runway, an attitude perfumed by immense mediation, unsteady social sphere, and a reflection of a self. Don't forget, when the word fashion is spoken, the word narcissism follows close behind. But don't fret. Per American novelist Wayne Kostenbaum's pithy reminder, narcissism isn't evil, it's ordinary. It's self-evaluations at the workplace, profile pictures for social media, and looking at yourself in the mirror before you leave the house. Oscillating between branding, self-recognition, sexuality, political uniform, and economic indicator, our adornment always reflects a chosen position in and with society, and that position projects what we value. Narcissus didn't think he was transfixed by his own reflection in the pond, but rather a beauty the likes of which he had never seen before. So told time and time again that ours is a narcissistic age, how do we, as fully sentient beings, positively reveal or covertly enact desires before the distorted mirror of time? So this exhibition came about really fast, within 6 months, which in museum time is nothing at all. I got hired, and they said, here's the date for your first show. Give us the checklist in 6 months. It's like, oh, okay, thank you. How does the computer turn on? And as I often start curatorial, like things, I always drag things along with me. And I think it's important to trust the things that you drag along with you. And so given this quick moment, I was like, well, what do I do now? I need a show, I need an idea, and I need to do studio visits and a checklist fast. Since I read it in the 90s, I've been fascinated by this quote of J.G. Ballard. I've always liked J.G. Ballard. He's one of like those writers that I always go to for, he'll tell me what to do. And this quote I've never understood. A recognition that nature has endowed us with one skin too few, I can understand that, and a fully sentient being should wear its nervous system externally. It's like, okay, like sentient to like feel things more than you sort of reason them, but like nervous system externally, how you touch the world. But I decided now's the time. And this is the first museum show I had, and so being someone that had always been maybe accused of doing things that were sort of small, difficult to deal with, text heavy, I decided what could be more sort of tactile than clothing, fashion, pictures of people. So, for example, Frances Stark's dress that she wears, this collage, which is actually sort of a Narcissus collage. So on the one level hand is like a sort of figure that she's collaged out of clothing that she used to wear and mailing that she's received at her house. And then when she cut out the form to put on the canvas, the cutout becomes the reflection that's in the little display there on the right. A photograph from a runway show that Zoe Leonard took in the mid-90s. Oops, back to, well, I won't. This video, which is just Karen Klimnick having collected all of her favorite scenes of Kate Moss from various interviews with Kate Moss. This pile of clothing by Scott Trelevin is when he got sick of making these small zines that he was known for around Toronto, and these small collages. He decided to take the paper that he always used to make those collages and make 3 sets of outfits that were similar to the clothes that he wore every day, and sort of use that as a sort of getting out of that artwork. And so this is sort of like him literally sort of leaving his artwork as outfits behind. The 3 photographs are by artist Aaron Leland, who spent nights as a mannequin in a store window and had hid a camera with a shutter release in the window. And when people would recognize that she was a person and not a mannequin, would take the picture right as like they were caught sort of window shopping. And then that's one of a couple paintings that I had by Paulina Oloska that she made of these fashion tear sheets that the Polish government circulated as ways of trying to stem the tide of Western fashion coming into communist Poland, and there were communist-approved fashions to wear. And then what I saw, sort of like one of the first things I knew I was going to do in the show when I had this idea, my first thought was like fashion designers. But then my second thought was like, well, all of my important curatorial friends were telling me fashion's stupid and dumb and cheap and exclusive and just a trifle. Why are you interested in this? And I thought like, well, we're not sitting here at the coffee shop naked, so there's something, somehow we've decided these clothes that we've bought, and somehow they mean something to us. So how can I sort of circumnavigate the sort of desire to just quickly sort of slough off fashion as being important? And I decided to look for things that might be as impractical or as inventive as what we would consider runway designs that can't be worn every day, but maybe that were worn every day or were meant for life. So for example, these are 5 of 32 masks that remain from an 80s rapper and graffiti artist in New York, Ramel Z, who had been friends with Basquiat and came up in sort of same time. And Ramel Z slowly got more and more sort of paranoid, stopped going out, and he made all of these identities for himself. And he saw himself as not one identity, but 32 identities. And when he gave interviews, when he was photographed, he would still perform on stage with bands. He would choose which identities were going to speak that night. And those are the identities that would appear. And they all had different characteristics, different songs, different superpowers, different relationships to, like, some of them were his dark side, some of them were his good side, some were simply the transcribers for the middle. So there's, I mean, not that it really matters, but there's Ripcord Rex on the left, then Reaper Grim, Wind, Vane the Insane, and then Chimer. And so I brought these out because they're made from Tonka trucks, Tupperware, bottle caps, old clothes, plastic that he modeled himself, other masks, and they're like these large collages, like sort of really quite intricate. And these were worn every day by him. Like he died in 2010. And so from 85 to 2010, every day he wore these things. He was never seen without one of these outfits. And they weren't actually sort of fantastical, despite the fact that they might look impractical or something. Like they were part of his life and what his life was about. Then there was also, of course, like a mirror photograph by Zoe Leonard. And I did try to sort of develop the show as sort of like stupid little narratives. So you'd see sort of clothes in their proper state, clothes on the floor, the mirror that maybe you would want to check yourself in as you've put the clothes on, to think through the ways that like the show could sort of come together in artworks while not crafting them into a narrative or making them have different theories than they did have in and of themselves. They could start to think of like a way that clothing is used and sort of comes around in a space. Sort of like the main part of the gallery just after the Ramel Z. So for example, there was a self-published magazine by Bernadette Corporation. That was the first thing that you saw when you went in, which is a fashion magazine they ran for 3 years. And that we also made available on an iPad so that people could actually read these rare books. And a sort of what I think of as like a dandyish umbrella, because it's a cheap street side umbrella that the artist, sad you can't really see it, but has sequined the umbrella by like sewing sequins into the entire surface and then added a top hat so you look good in the rain. 2 photographs by the author Hilton Alls, another painting by Paulina Loska, a sort of sleeping bag envelope, and then a fashion line done by the artist Seth Price in collaboration with a fashion designer Tim Hamilton. 2 canvases, which are actually textiles that were produced by an artist Carissa Rodriguez in the same sort of factory outside Antwerp that makes fabrics for designers like Margiela and Ralph Simmons and various high-end people. A t-shirt by Linda Benglis that I won't get into because it's a little complicated, and then 2 collages by Belgian Anmi van Kerkhoven that use fashion images. Another shot of that scene, so you can see the sort of Paulina painting a little bit maybe clearer. It's sort of a guy in a sort of ski glasses and a sort of knitted sweater. And one thing that I definitely wanted for the show was for it to have all the different ways that we sort of consume fashion to be a part of the show. So there are photographs, there are advertisements, there are videos, actual clothes, accessories, magazines, paintings, snapshots, as well as like composed photos. Like it was all meant to sort of come together. And then one thing I did do as well is have something like this, which is Genesis Breyer Peorge. For people who don't know, Genesis Breyer Peorge was a performance artist, then a mail artist who sort of mailed his materials out to the world. Then he formed a group, Throbbing Gristle, which is considered the first industrial electronic group in the world in the mid-70s, and then has gone on to form like several groups after that, and has recently been sort of modifying. He now requires that he's referred to as she, because he's not having simple gender surgery to become a woman, but his wife, who sadly died recently, they were both going under modification to become in between, to become both male and female together. Like they both wanted to meet in the middle and be pandrogynous. And so for him, for her now, him, now her, what I found interesting was like, this was like not just fashion. Fashion's always been important to Genesis. Genesis has always attended to like the accoutrements that are on the body, but like the skin itself becomes something that sort of broadcasts and gets used. And so in that scope, this display of 33 items in a scarf is not actually items of artwork that Genesis makes, who does make a lot of artwork, but are personal jewelry and personal rings and earrings and necklaces and belts that Genesis wears on a day-to-day basis. And it's actually the stuff that's been made for Genesis by followers, by herself. One of the members of of Genesis's band is a silversmith, and so they make their own jewelry. And so it's all the things that Genesis actually uses to sort of be Genesis and to be this form. Other displays. This was maybe a little thing, and of course I sadly don't have videos to share because the artists have them in long story, but there were commercials in the video room by a group, Inez and Venude, and I was interested in having commercials made by them for 2 reasons. A, because Inez and Venude as a group were known as art photographers in the early 90s, gave themselves over to the fashion world and have basically become the fashion photographers for the fashion world now, working for all the magazines, but then have started making video commercials now that they're sort of have such a sort of studio behind them. And so I was fascinated by, like, they're no longer artists, on one level you could say, but have sort of given themselves over. And so I had 2 commercials that they did for Yves Saint Laurent, and then a commercial they did for Vogue Paris. And so I felt like if you're going to do fashion, you can't avoid branding. You shouldn't be sort of afraid to be branded yourself or to sort of get messy with what logos mean. But if I was also going to get messy with logos, I was going to pair that, as I did here, with, again, 2 masks that are by an Egyptian artist, Nader Sadek, who makes all of the stage accoutrements, well, not all anymore, but many of the stage accoutrements for a Hungarian black metal vocalist, Attila Kashar. And so these are items that are sort of go out, and they're usually on tour with the band, and only because the band's not touring for a year is why sort of Attila brought them to the States for me to show. And so these are masks that are made for Nader's, and then this fleshy thing that's hanging is a sort of cast resin logo of the band that they always use on stage. And so I sort of have like this sort of degraded logo with the sort of gloss logos behind it. The logo that's, carted around and used as sort of a piece of meat against like the more sort of ephemeral and just out there logo. But the videos are great. I mean, I could try. Then there was a series of photographs by a writer, Hilton Alls, who's written a lot about style. And one reason why I like curating shows too is because I have an excuse to go to Hilton Alls and say, you've written about style, I respect you. What can you tell me about style as I'm about to do the show? What will I do wrong? And Hilton can respond and say, well, for 20 years I've made photographs. Did you know this? I said, no, I didn't know this. And so for the second time ever, he's showing photographs in his 25-year professional history. And we're sort of pulling out some photographs that he did. Collages by another artist, Wardell Milan. And then similarly, a sort of book and series of portraits by an artist, John Miller, Ora Rosenberg, and Paulina Olowska. And just as I know I'm getting to the end here, but I want to say, I am getting to the end, holy cow. Well, maybe I'll end with that. So for example, this is another case, this is a book that we produced for the show. It's, when I talked to the artist John Miller, he said, I don't know why you're asking me to be in the show. I'm not interested in fashion. And I said, well, you've done sculptures with people. The people wear clothes. Don't you think that's something? He's like, I don't think so. So I left the studio visit a little dejected. And then he sent me an email the next day, and he's like, by the way, did I mention that myself and Ora, his wife, 10 years ago, designed a children's fashion do and don't book with our daughter and allowed her to choose her fashion rules? And the publisher declined to print the book. I was like, funny enough, John, no, you didn't mention that book. And even though I didn't know it, I guess that's why I'm here. I sensed that something was there. And so it was also like an enjoyable thing to sort of bring out these works that sort of people are sort of not known for and that haven't sort of previously exhibited. But I want to, you can't really see it here. There's like a picture of 4 shoes that Hilton took for himself. Another close-up of Briar Purge's stuff. And then there's a large installation by a Serbian artist of shoes. Maybe this will be a proper image for this quote. And this is a text that Hilton wrote, and that's presented in the show as if it's a piece. And I think it summarizes pretty much what I always hope for, to get sort of moods in shows, and one reason why this show felt strong to me. And it's a little confusing, but hopefully it'll play out. Moments after the memorial, they stepped out into less complicated air. It was warm for an early winter day. The atmosphere was gray and humid and still, despite the traffic sounds and the people movement beyond. Clutching his friend's hands, the man said, I'm glad you were there. They looked at one another. One man was chewing gum, and the one who wasn't longed for some of his own. They decided to cross the avenue to get a stick. But before that, the man who wasn't chewing gum was stopped by another man. He was as tall and brown as the gumless one, and he said, excuse me, but aren't you blank? The man without gum nodded. His interlocutor continued, you may not remember me, but I'm blank. We met many years ago through a third blank. It was maybe 20 years ago, and you were wearing the same shoes you're wearing now. And I just have to say how much I like them and what you do. The man without gum, but with the shoes, looked down at them. They were saddle shoes. the first saddle shoes he had ever bought for himself. And he knew the man who complimented him was referring to his previous pair of saddle shoes that were a gift from a friend. Looking back as he looked at the man who admired them, he remembered how, after his friend had presented him with the saddle shoes, he sat at another desk at the newspaper they both worked at then and polished them for him. Such was the work and the emotion of that day. Years later, the backs of those shoes broke down, and as he crossed 8th Avenue one day, the always grateful and shy recipient of his friend's largesse in saddle shoes saw a variation of those same saddle shoes in a shop window and put them out of his mind almost at once. He could not replace the memory of his friend slowly rubbing oil into those first pair of shoes, ever, despite the fact that they hadn't seen this friend for many years. He hadn't seen this friend for many years. He went to an organic food shop, and he thought about the shoes. They would not leave him alone. What was he supposed to do with his memory of love and care and the necessity of new shoes? Would he have to buy his own shoes forever? Why did buying new shoes feel as though he was cheating on the old shoes? His friend, the man who bought him the first pair of saddle shoes, was sacred, and yet he needed new shoes, shoes that reminded him of his friend and yet carried him into the future. So he bought the new saddle shoes, and as he crossed the avenue right now in search of his stick of gum, he realized that the person he and his present friend had just memorialized was one of the few people who knew something of his old saddle shoes. And already that day, hope and death stuck to the shoes of his new pair, just like gum. I think that's as good of an end as any I would come up with. I have no idea how to answer questions. I know I didn't really get into the Whitney, that big beast that I'm now in charge of.
Thanks. That was very interesting. I'm Miriam Kaufman, and I don't actually have a question, but I want other people to, so I thought I'd get up and say something. And what I thought I would get up and say is that what I was knitting and designing as we talked, as you talked, is part of that plasticity you're talking about. So there's now going to be a piece of fashion designed and knit while you were discussing curating this thing that's kind of about fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's good. I mean, that's exactly what I'm thinking about. And that's, I guess like in a larger sense, I do think, like this, and of course I shuffle pieces of paper so I get them lost. But like the story of Alls, why it seemed like sort of an ending point is like like an object has two things stuck to that. One person knows half the story, another one sees it from another story. And I guess we always get hung up about the artist's intention and the artist's desire and I think like objects are strange things when they're released into the world. And I'm interested in trying to do something with the very complex things that objects do when they leave an artist's studio or a production studio, or even when you buy a bottle of water and where you carry it or where it's not appropriate to carry it to. And maybe I'll just use this as a thing, like another letter that I've been thinking about recently. And this is actually something I am thinking about in terms of the Whitney, is a letter by an artist, Jimmy Durham, who, for those who don't know, is a Native American artist who refuses to step foot in America anymore for various political and sort of social reasons, and has lived throughout Europe decades now. And he wrote, and everything Jimmy does is artwork. So he wrote a letter, which is just a letter to a friend, but also been shown as a work of art once after he sent it to the friend. And the letter says simply, "The fact that we have so few possessions gives us a kind of terrible freedom, the same kind of freedom that any other animal has. And maybe that is why we surround ourselves with hundreds of things. We pretend that we own them, and we pretend that we can hide in them. Everything in the world has a kind of integrity. Each metal, like iron, for example, has its distinct qualities, and it's always true to itself. Dogs might be loyal friends to humans, but they have integrity to themselves. That being true, what can we say that we actually own? If iron owns iron and each dog owns itself, we own just our bodies. If one feels the need to make a sacrifice then, the sole proper offering is one's body, because you have nothing to give but yourself. And I sort of think it's sort of like a beautiful way of sort of thinking about how to also be a generous viewer, a generous citizen, a generous thing.
Hi, Catherine Ramba. I really enjoyed your talk. I found it very stimulating. So my question is very simple, but it's just a sort of prompt to hear more ideas. I'm just wondering if you had unlimited support, unlimited finances, what would be that ideal show that you would curate now? Or what's that idea that you think, oh, I would love to do that?
I'm from the Midwest, and I'm sort of like a ruined Lutheran. So I don't think there's any such thing as unlimited resources and unlimited. It's not something I'm prepared to even conceptualize. But maybe I would answer that by saying that is where I come from, and so I guess I kind of think what I actually find is the most interesting thing to do. I love my job. I've loved my jobs in the past. I mean, there's been times I've moved on for various fiscal or personal reasons, but I've loved them all in different ways and found ways to engage myself in them. And I think it's less a question of thinking what the dream position is, and it's more, I find it's always fascinating to think through limitations. And so even with this show that I just did at the ICA, which is huge and the second largest budget I've ever had to work with for an exhibition, and the only other time I've had a larger budget was when I was working on someone else's exhibition, not my own. It's fascinating to look at the space, to look at what you have, to look at your audience, to look at what you can reach, and figure out how to make that the richest experience. And those are actually the things that, not to sound easy or something, but they're actually dreams to me. So yeah, I would love to have been given the Whitney Biennial by myself, but I love that building, and I'm happy just to be working with the floor of that building. I'm happy to just be thinking of 1/3 of it, because I love that building so much, and the Whitney's moving from that building, and I can't believe that I'm one of 3 people that gets to have a statement of how they leave that building. One thing I'm working on right now, which is something I've wanted to do for about 8 years, is there's an artist, writer, Christopher Knowles, who's, I should know this, I'm one of the experts, I think he's 57 now, and he's autistic. And so he's never quite had a career, and he obviously doesn't sort of professionalize himself as a way of actually dealing with galleries himself and museums himself. But he has family that have always taken care of him. He's done typings of poetry and text. He's done audio pieces, videos, theater pieces, paintings, drawings. And through his career, he's often collaborated with Robert Wilson, and in fact, the opera theater person, and Robert Wilson, half of Robert Wilson's pieces in the 70s, either the entire libretto or half of the libretto is by Christopher Knowles. And I'm just excited to actually have a space that's large enough, and it has the climate control and the vitrines and the stuff to finally sort of deal with this work and get this work as a survey, and not just as the little trinkets that have been here and there, and the things that have been given to people, and the things that have been shared with people. But I'm actually happy to sort of be pulling that together. And that'll happen, and there'll be another dream job or another dream thing that occurs to me while I'm working on that one. It's some of the smallest books that I've done with $2,000 have been my favorite projects. It's not about the dream, it's about what you do with the situation and how you meet the artist and how you make that stuff sort of physically matter, I guess.
Thanks.
So I have a question. Speaking of limitations and vitrines, I would like to have your thoughts on what happens to distribution when it ends, if it does. artist books and art ephemera entering a public collection?
Well, it's complicated, because on one level, one thing, unless there's only one example of something left, I would say the distribution doesn't really end. It just might end locally, where that one particular object is at that point. I mean, for example, I have a collection of about 1,000 artist books that I didn't intend to start collecting, but I just started collecting because I would be in used bookstores and find things for $20 that were actually $1,000 books that were just like in the wrong place in the wrong state of the United States, that were in the wrong bookstore in the wrong town. And who knows how they got there, and then I sort of give them a different life. So, but I would say that, like for example, one reason why, I'm trying to find just like this little image of like these 3 magazines. These magazines, you find them online for like $600 each. I wanted them in the show because I thought they were one of the best projects that artist group has ever done, this fashion magazine that they ran. But I didn't want them just in a vitrine. So we have an iPad in the lobby that has them as ebooks available. And so I think, books are pretty don't mean this dumb in the wrong way, but books are pretty dumb objects. Like a painting can be up on the wall and untouched and do its job. Like a book in a vitrine doesn't do much. A book in a library not being accessed doesn't do much. And so I think the trick is, once the distribution has gotten them into these public institutions, how do the public institutions deal with them? And how do they make them public? In the 70s, I know the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago's library, and it used to collect 2 copies of artist books. And it would drill a hole in one so that they could hang it in the gallery for people to flip through, and then have one in the library, like pristine, exact. And that's how they dealt it at that time. There's a fantastic show of Russian avant-garde books at MoMA. Maybe it was right before MoMA in New York moved. And in that exhibition, they had everything in vitrines, but then every 4 vitrines, they had computer stations with books from those vitrines digitized so that you could sort of flip through them. And so I think, flipping through a computer screen isn't the same thing as having the book in your hands, particularly when someone has made something that might use the paper stock or might use the ink quality or the embossing quality in it, but these are ways that they can actually be made available. Lots of museums are sitting on poster projects that they never put on display from conceptual art, even though they were considered artworks by the artists. So I think it's less about the objects and it's more about the curator, and if the curator is being inventive enough to make them visible or viewable or somehow approachable.
Yeah, my name's Julian Brown. I have a question about restrictions. I'd like to go back 2 questions, the question before the last one. Everybody has to work with restrictions of one sort or another, and the question is, for a curator doing work such as you're doing, which restrictions are likely to lead to the most creative solutions? The restrictions of money or restrictions of space, personal limitations, or perhaps ethnic restrictions. There's a whole lot of restrictions. Which of those restrictions is most likely to lead to a very creative result?
I don't think there's a curator alive who would say the financial restrictions are the most feeding or nutritious. I guess the restrictions that become maybe the most engaging are like the ones that you just make for yourself, I think, as long as you don't turn them into rules of behavior. So, for example, one of the things I did decide with this show was that it was going to be all figurative work somehow. Like the figure might be loosely alluded to, but everything in it was going to be a person, be something that goes on a person, be something that drapes a person, be something that's used by a person, like an actual tool or something. I've usually avoided figurative work, done everything in my power to avoid figurative work. I've very rarely worked with photographers. And so there were just like things that I was like, okay, the new limitation is like, you have to do this. and you can't stop looking for things that interest you until you actually get into that space. So like with a show like this, there's lots of artists that have worked with the industry of fashion and like how it's actually distributed and how it's produced, all the sort of things that I usually geek about. And I was like, none of that work's going to be in this show. It's going to be all things that are either clothing or depict clothing or that depict bodies or that depict people doing things. And so it was like a weird limitation that I just made for myself. And I was like, I have to stick to it. No matter what I'm interested in, everything has to somehow, come into this little sort of grouping. I think like those are the restrictions. Because what happens, I think in the best situations is that you're a smart enough worker that you come to the job with the limitations, and then you realize in your mind what those limitations let loose, and you know how to play with them. And then so like the limitation that you build from yourself from the actual real situation is what becomes sort of an engagement.
Hi, my name's Christine Conley. I'm really enjoyed what you've had to say about curating in relationship to this notion of the conversation with the artist, which of course is what keeps a lot of curators going. And I think you've partially answered or anticipated my question when you talked about ways of looking at books by having them available digitally. I wonder if you have other thoughts on how to use technologies in ways that might extend that experience of the conversation with the artist. And the other half of that question, I suppose, is do you see the status of printed objects, books, and so on, shifting, given that we are increasingly into a, paperless digital mode of communication?
Yeah, it's two questions. And the first one's like, I should preface and say, don't be fooled by this thing that's in front of me. Like, I'm practically a Luddite. I don't really know. I'm not very good with digital formats at all. I can barely work Microsoft Word, barely. And all the time people are going, this is what it can do. I'm like, oh, look at that. It merged documents. Look. So I tend to rely on, I guess you could say, like I try to engage myself with artists who are interested in these questions or in organizations that are interested in. And so I rely on, most of the things I've curated have actually been collaborations with other people. Or when you work on an artist's commission, you're basically collaborating with the artist on what's going to happen. And so, I've been involved in radio plays and things, and some film shoots. And so I guess I try to be smart enough to ask like the dumb questions that makes the person that actually knows how to do this stuff respond a little bit better. So I don't personally have thoughts about like digitizing that much and how to use it more, because I barely read online. I barely have an online existence, really. It's a truly online experience or advanced experience. And in terms of paper, I kind of feel like, years ago, CDs killed vinyl records. And then in terms of like the music geek or the music buying community, it might be smaller than it used to be, but vinyl records for many record labels now outsell the CDs, which you can just get like on iTunes or get on some like online Amazon, or you just buy the tracks that you want. So the vinyl has come forward for the people that the object matters. The object comes back. And I think it's sad to see bookstores closing, and it's sad to see things like that happening, but I think books aren't going anywhere. And like for example, like the New York Artist Book Fair, and that's held every year at PS1, it increases its attendance by about 1/3 every year. And last year I actually went and only stayed there for an hour because it was so hot and so crammed. I know a lot of these publishers. I'm just coming back. I'm not even trying to fight this crowd. And so I think might be smaller, and like obviously like there's like the hiccups that happen when like an industry is made at this scale and has to go to a different scale. There's sadly going to be winners, losers, things that fall by the wayside. And I also think, books, to think about formats. Formats weren't always the most important. The format of something wasn't always what its actual existence was. Like I have to admit, I'm not too sad about the death of newspapers, because I feel like, at one point, a printed piece of paper was the best way to get information about what was happening at that moment out. Like it was cheap paper, it was cheaply produced, and it could appear the next day. But now there's better ways for that news to actually. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that content's always so good at the same time, but I think so it makes sense that newspapers would die. Different books have different reasons for living. Like a novel can be read on a Kindle, but most art books can't be read on a Kindle. But some art book publishers have been releasing picture books that if you want the book that has the good reproductions, you buy the book. And if you buy the ebook version, it might have links to videos and links to transcripts and links to other things that can sort of make the sort of information that's within it richer. And so they find the ways for their objects to have these dual lives. And so I think it's being important to that sort of format. Books aren't really going to go anywhere. There's too many people who put them on their shelves and give them as gifts, and handing over like a Kindle doesn't always feel, good as a gift. You can't inscribe it. You can't, at least not yet.
My name is Mary Smith, and the other day I listened to a historian give a lecture called The Deep History of People and Things. And one of the stories he told was about the Franklin expedition that went up to the Arctic. And of course, it was a tragic end to it. But as they've discovered, people who, there were some members of the crew that tried to head away and look for a way to save themselves. And they took things with them. And I just thought it was interesting, since we've talked a little bit about books, that one of the people took with him a copy of the novel The Vicar of Wakefield, which was very popular at that particular time. But the idea that he would have taken this book, which would perhaps have had no real use to save his life, took it with him, and years and years later, it was discovered by people. Of course, it was frozen into the tundra, so it was perfectly preserved.
Yeah. No, I love that stuff. It's why I'm in art. It's like, who could explain these objects or why they attract, us? But they don't really do anything. We can't use them. But we use them for something, obviously. It's just not typical use value.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Cowan. There's been a lot of talk about artists' books at this talk, and I just wanted to tell everyone that there is an exceptional exhibition in Douglas Library of artists' books by book artists in Eastern Ontario. So if you want to head across the street, you'll get a chance to see some of this stuff.
Great.
Okay, last chance. Burning question. Well, no, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.